All right. Hi, I'm Chad. Welcome to Lost Theologies. Today, I wanted to talk about the the synoptic problem. We're off to a good start. I already can't say the words. The synoptic problem is kind of a standard concept in critical biblical scholarship, where you look at the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you realize that they are related, and specifically, they have a literary relation. So somehow through some mix of some sources, they are using similar sources and or copying from one another. So the typical way this is looked at is that Mark was probably written first, and Matthew and Luke are copying from Mark for a large portion of their passages. There's word for word agreement across lots of different places in those gospels. And this is fairly standard stuff in, like academic biblical world. It's definitely not standard stuff in the pews or in evangelical Protestant Christianity, in which I was raised. My dad was a pastor, and I heard him preach about the Bible every week, if not more often. And I didn't really know any of this stuff until later on when I became Catholic and got a little more familiar with critical scholarship. And then I was Catholic for 9 years. And after that, I became an atheist and got even more into learning about the Bible from kind of a secular standpoint or a literature standpoint. And anyway, so the relation of these three gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John's kind of unique in its own sense. But the three gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, how that relates and the different hypotheses about who used which as a source and who copied from whom, that's wrapped up in this phrase, the synoptic problem. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a problem. It just means it's like a puzzle for scholars to figure out. Anyway, this is a clip from Pinecreek Doug talking to Rebecca at the Bread of Life. I think her channel is called Bread of Life. And he is bringing up an example of the synoptic problem and pressing her on it. And his particular example is of Jesus meeting Matthew, who traditionally wrote the book of Matthew. And both Matthew and Mark describe the story of Jesus meeting Matthew. The problem or the interesting thing about this story is it's almost word for word the same in both Matthew and Mark. And the question is, if Matthew was an eyewitness and he is describing Jesus meeting himself, why does he copy Mark? So let's listen.
It does not compute that. Why would you, if you're writing down your personal testimony of how you met Christ, which is what Matthew's doing here?
Yes.
You would not copy someone else's work on how you met Christ. And that's what Matthew, if you really believe Matthew wrote Matthew, that's what you're saying.
You know what? Like he is adding some additional details, but I mean, like if anyone else thinks I'm just brushing this aside, like I don't see a problem with this at all. So like if you guys all think that this is a problem, then say, yes, Rebecca, this is a problem. This is
it's a problem.
No, Rebecca, it's not a horrible problem.
I just don't see an issue with this.
Right. I understand. There's bigger fish to fry. I get that. But on this one little meaningless point, I think it's what I just said is incredibly reasonable and expected. That if you met Christ, you would not copy your personal testimony from someone about your personal experience of meeting Christ for the first time. And that's what Matthew's doing. He's copying Mark and using himself in the third person. To me, that's checkmate. You're done.
I'll cut off his awesome music, but I like how Doug frames this as like it's both a nothing problem and it's checkmate, you're done. And I totally agree. And I think there's an aspect to this that is going to challenge evangelical Protestants that I haven't heard people talk about a lot concerning the synoptic problem. And let me see if I can lay it out for how I would have thought of this as really challenging in my younger years when I was an evangelical Protestant. and that is this. If the Gospels are written by eyewitnesses and they are the Word of God and they are holy, their writings are holy and inerrant and inspired by God. So this doctrine of inspiration, that God inspired them to write it the way he wanted it. If that's true, and Matthew is dependent upon Mark for his writings, that means that Matthew was a Christian and Mark was a Christian, and that Matthew wrote the Bible and Mark wrote the Bible, and Matthew was inspired and Mark was inspired. All that has to be true. And at the same time, Matthew is copying Mark, but he's making changes while he's copying it. He's editing it. He's adding to it. He's subtracting from it. He's redacting it. So Matthew is taking the word of God, Mark, and he's changing it and making a new version called Matthew. And for an evangelical Protestant to say that's not a big deal would be disingenuous, because that is a nail in the coffin of inspiration, at least in the most basic way that I think evangelical Protestants would understand inspiration. Someone taking the word of God and changing it and adding their own spin on it is unthinkable and would cause me to throw the whole thing out as far as inspiration goes. Now, I'm not saying it's not possible to come up with a broader understanding of inspiration, and I think that's what most would do if they did admit to themselves that these works were being copied and changed and edited from one gospel to another. They could say, okay, Mark was inspired, and then Matthew was also inspired, and his changes and edits were inspired in order to give another flair. But I don't know. I think that would be quite a stretch. So anyway, that's my opinion on how the synoptic problem is a inspiration problem, especially for a basic understanding of inspiration that would exist in the pews in evangelical Protestantism. So thanks. Welcome to the channel. Hope to have more content for you like this in the future. In the meantime, please subscribe to Pinecreek Doug and to Bread of Life. I like both of those channels quite a bit, and we'll talk to you soon.